Welcome to The Prescription, the Tax Policy Center's biweekly webcast on fiscal policy. This is one of a series of conversations with state, local, and federal government officials, as well as leading economists and other experts. I'm your host, Howard Gleckman, a senior fellow at TPC and editor of our blog, TaxVox. My guest today is Barbara Angus. She's global tax policy leader at the firm EY. From 2016 through 2018, she served as chief tax counsel for the House Ways and Means Committee, where she worked on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Previously, she was international tax lead for the Treasury Department and business tax counsel for the Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation. She also worked in private practice for more than 20 years. She has her JD from Harvard Law School and an MBA from the University of Chicago. Before we get started, our usual bit of housekeeping. We encourage audience members to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The event's being recorded and will be posted online on TPC's website in the near future. We're using captioning, which you can adjust or turn off with the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you'd like to join the conversation on social media, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And if you'd like to suggest a future guest for The Prescription, just email us at info@taxpolicycenter.org. Barbara Angus, welcome to The Prescription.
Thank you, Howard. It's a pleasure to be talking with you today.
It's good to see you again. So we'll be talking international taxes. The OECD has developed an international tax reform model based on two pillars. Pillar one is an effort to partly tax big multinationals based on where their customers are located. And pillar two is a 15% global minimum tax. Both need final agreement by multinational organizations such as the OECD and the EU, and they need to be adopted by each individual member country. So far-reaching proposals such as this create corporate winners and losers. How should we think about which industries are most likely to benefit from these changes and which are most likely to be hurt by them?
You know, that is an interesting question, Howard, and I think a difficult one to think about, probably different for both of the pillars. And the two pillars are each very complicated in terms of their rules, in terms of their use of financial accounting instead of tax accounting principles. And so there are a lot of very unexpected effects. Certainly there are some industries that have where there are particular implications. For example, Pillar One's connection to digital services taxes and the fact that implementation of Pillar One, part of the agreement includes agreement by countries to withdraw any digital services taxes or other similar measures and to forego ever putting those rules into place. And so there's a particular implication for Pillar One for those businesses that otherwise would be subject to digital services taxes. But really, both of these pillars have broad reach, particularly Pillar Two that has a much lower revenue threshold. The pillars also create, you could think of it in terms of winners and losers among governments, which makes it a particularly unusual and almost unprecedented project for the OECD, because there are countries for particularly under Pillar One, for any country that gains taxing rights over some global business income, there will be another country that needs to give up those taxing rights.
So it sounds like the short answer is this is going to be very complicated, that there will be businesses that will benefit from some provisions, maybe from Pillar Two, let's say, but may be damaged by Pillar One and vice versa.
It is very complicated. It is complicated both in terms of the tax effect, also the compliance aspects of it, just the calculations that are required. If you look at Pillar Two, for example, the global minimum tax rules, which are based on a starting point of financial income calculated using financial accounting principles, but with myriad adjustments, that will require a huge amount of data that isn't collected by companies today in that particular form. And so they'll need to put into place systems to do all of those, to collect all of that data and continue to maintain it, and then do all of those calculations. And so certainly there will be many companies where the costs associated with compliance far exceed any additional tax that's due because of the global minimum tax, and all of those burdens associated with compliance also translate to significant responsibilities for the tax authorities in terms of doing all the calculations and review that they'll need to do.
So we'll dig into complexity over the next few minutes, but let me ask you about timing of this. So the EU's efforts to finalize its own Pillar 2 agreements been stalled by Hungary, as we've seen over the last couple of weeks. Even before its current political upheaval, the UK announced it's not going to implement Pillar 2 at least until 2024. The OECD itself announced that Pillar 1 won't be finalized until the middle of next year and not enforced until 2024. Do you think that this new timing is realistic?
It is, I think, more realistic than the original timing. The original timing was very, very ambitious. Certainly seemed to reflect sort of the need. I think from the government's perspective, it reflected their views about the importance of this, but also seemed to be in some sense a way of keeping work going. But in terms of getting to implementation, particularly in a situation like this, where, as you said, this will require that each country implement these rules as part of their domestic law, but they need to do that on a coordinated basis. So with respect to Pillar 2, the OECD and Inclusive Framework released model rules at the very end of December. And then a couple of months later released commentary with respect to those model rules. There are myriad interpretive questions that the OECD has acknowledged. Some of them are noted in the commentary, where they're working on agreed administrative guidance. And there's all the procedural aspects of Pillar 2 that are yet to be worked out. That's the current phase of the work on this document, or this set of documents, really, that they're calling the implementation framework. The more that is agreed and established before countries start to implement, the greater chance there is for consistency across countries. And consistency is critically important in terms of getting to not having overlapping minimum taxes. And greater consistency would eliminate what will be sort of huge complexity for if there are overlapping or inconsistent rules.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question to explore. So, of course, here President Biden's been pushing for reforms of the 2017 GILTI provisions that would largely sync up with the OECD model. And I guess the question is, what would happen to the global initiative if the U.S. fails to adopt it?
Well, the design of Pillar 2 from the beginning is focused on giving those countries that are interested, that are concerned about low taxed foreign income, the ability to impose additional top-up taxes on low taxed income earned in other countries. In other words, it wasn't an initiative that was aimed at forcing low tax countries to increase their tax rate, because the OECD, these organizations don't have the ability to do that. It is likely that the reaction, and certainly particularly with the addition of this idea of a qualified domestic minimum tax that would allow a low tax country to top up its own taxes, and certainly it's likely that will be the reaction of many countries, because otherwise it's a windfall to other countries. But it's not, the structure of this was designed to not be dependent on any particular country enacting Pillar 2 rules. Sort of there's defensive measures or backstop rules. I would say, you said that you described the currently pending provisions in the U.S., the changes to the U.S. GILTI rules, which was a version could be viewed as a version of a minimum tax from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Those modifications that are currently pending in Congress do move the GILTI rules in the direction of the Pillar 2 design in a couple of significant respects, but the GILTI design is still very different than the Pillar 2 design, and so they would not be completely aligned, and even as amended, there would be some significant differences the tax base is different, for example, and there are a whole lot of differences that could combine to have some significant effects and so certainly something to consider going forward is what would be the implications of the U.S. acting to partially move guilty in the direction of Pillar 2, or maybe another way to say it is it seems like it would be of value for the U.S. to consider moving U.S. law to be fully aligned with Pillar 2, particularly with the U.S. as a significant advocate for Pillar 2. It would put the U.S. in the position of embracing the consistency that is so important for the system to work.
So I guess I have to ask, based on your experience on the Hill, do you think that Congress is prepared to do that?
Well, I think that I think comes down to a timing question. They're looking at, obviously, these changes to the BBB to the guilty rules are part of the so-called Build Back Better package, which is pending right now with the potential for action in the next several weeks. Given that the Pillar 2 design is still being fleshed out, it would be hard to fully align with Pillar 2, to be sure that you're fully aligned with Pillar 2 until it's further fleshed out. I think as a practical matter, it would not be possible to pivot to full Pillar 2 compliance in the current time frame of the reconciliation package.
Could it be done? I guess the question is, could it be done in a bipartisan way if it were not part of the reconciliation package, if we were to do this, say, next year? Well,
I think that is a very interesting question. There are a lot of concerns about the Pillar 2 rules and what the implications are. So I think that would require significantly more study. And I think that there also would be interest in seeing what the rest of the world did. Is there significant take up of the Pillar 2 rules by other countries? We really have never seen a project like this coming out of the OECD that would require sort of U.S. legislative response, and so it makes it really a multi-dimensional chess game in a very complicated time, both in the U.S. and in the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's sort of an odd situation where you have many countries that are waiting for other countries. Nobody wants to be the first mover here. And it's going to be interesting to see who is willing to really kind of.
And certainly there are countries that as you mentioned, the EU has a pending directive, and which they released just a couple of days after the model rules were released and have continued to refine. The UK has indicated what their plans are, and there are some other individual countries that have begun the process.
So we talked a little bit about making these rules as consistent as possible, and it's been interesting to watch the evolution of this in the U.S. Congress. And we hear now the Democrats, even Democrats, are talking about watering down corporate tax changes included in the Build Back Better bill. So, for example, they're talking about excluding generous depreciation rules from their minimum tax calculation. And their version of the guilty reforms might allow cross-country pooling rather than country-by-country calculation. So what do you make of these changes? Are they moving us away from consistency, or how do you think about them?
Well, I think there are some significant issues. Again, this idea of a global agreement on sort of very fundamental tax principles that don't necessarily align with any country's tradition. When you think about it, when you look at the model rules, what any country would have to implement to get to the same final result could be quite different because they've got a different starting point. And I think there are certainly the guilty rules are a particular focus of the current discussions in the US, but also a very important focus was something that really hit the radar screen when the model rules were released, and they had adjusted. The model rules changed the the operation of the so-called backstop rule, the rule that used to be called the undertaxed payments rule, and now is just called the UTPR because it doesn't require payments between related parties for it to kick in. And that's a rule that allows any country that has an entity in a multinational group to impose a top-up tax on any low-taxed income within that group, even though the entity in that country might have no connection to that other low-taxed income in the group. And that rule potentially has the effect, even with a US multinational that's subject to GILTI, with or without its revisions on all its foreign source income, it could operate in some instances to impose top-up tax on the US multinationals' income earned in the US. And that has to do with the mechanics of the Pillar 2 calculation that has rules for how tax credits are taken into account. Credits that are treated as qualified refundable credits don't trigger top-up tax, but credits like the existing US general business credits would trigger top-up tax, and that has caused a lot of concern among multinationals and among many in Congress, because that would be the US having made a decision to provide an incentive for R&D and other things for which we have these credits, and then another country being able to come in and soak up that tax that the US has, basically override that incentive and collect that revenue. And that is a very complicated issue to resolve.
One process question that we got in the Q&A is does this require a tax treaty?
The discussions of Pillar 2 in the OECD have said that there is no tax treaty required with respect to Pillar 2, that it can be done purely by domestic law. Like many practitioners and academics look at it and are concerned that there is an awful lot in the relations between countries that are covered by tax treaties, and there are some aspects of tax treaties where the Pillar 2 rules seem inconsistent. The rules are proceeding sort of without dealing with that, but maybe the most important area where a treaty is needed is treaties provide the mechanism to resolve disputes between countries. And so if two countries have a different interpretation of how the minimum tax should apply, and there is no treaty between those countries, or no treaty that covers that dispute, it's not clear how that dispute could be resolved. And so while technically it's advancing without requiring a treaty, they do need to find some way to develop mechanisms for resolution of these issues, which typically happens through tax treaties.
Right. So it sounds like your advice would be to do it as a tax treaty.
I mean, they've looked at trying to find some kind of administrative agreement that wouldn't be a full-blown tax treaty to resolve these, or to piggyback on existing tax treaties. That said, the U.S. tax treaty network is quite small, certainly small compared to the size of our international sector.
Let's talk a little bit about minimum taxes, since they're so important to all of this. One of the things that's interesting to me is we have both Pillar 1 and a separate book minimum tax. And does it actually make sense to, in effect, have two minimum taxes?
Well, that is interesting, and I think in part it's because the U.S. book minimum tax developed on a completely separate path, having nothing to do with the Pillar 2 discussions, although they both ended up at a 15% rate, which creates a lot of confusion. But the book minimum tax that's pending in the BBB package does take into account general business credits, and so general business credits would not trigger application of that minimum tax, but the Pillar 2 minimum tax that could come in under the UTPR from another country would be triggered. The administration in its budget proposed that it would do a so-called qualified domestic minimum tax, which would be intended to collect exactly the tax that could be collected under the Pillar 2 top-up tax. So basically for the US to top up itself. It's not clear in the documents with respect to the budget proposal whether that was intended to replace the book minimum tax in the BBB package if it were enacted, or whether it was intended to be an addition. If it's an addition, we'd have an awful lot of different corporate tax bases.
Yeah, for sure. And there are a lot of critics who worry that the House version of the book minimum tax just isn't workable, that it's inefficient, it's administratively complex, it's subject to gaming. Are those legitimate concerns from your point of view?
Well, certainly, the U.S. has had in sort of the annals of history, the U.S. has had a minimum tax that functioned related to book income in the mid 80s that lasted for, I can't remember, but it was only a year or two before it was repealed, I think, for because it was overly complex and I think viewed as not doing what it was intended to do. And throughout history, there's been a lot of discussion about the fact that the standards around computing book income, the financial accounting standards, are aimed at a very different objective than the tax accounting standards. And so when you start to use that as a tax base, it does have some significant policy implications and potentially some ramifications for how book income is calculated. So I think those are all things that deserve significant thought and have over the years, which is why we haven't had such a tax until this proposal.
So here in the think tank world, we like to think about broadening the corporate tax base. And that's really the way to do this. If you want to get rid of preferences, just get rid of preferences. But that's, as you know better than I from your time on the Hill, that's easier said than done. So some alternative solutions around. MIT accounting professor Michelle Hanlon has suggested allowing firms only 80% of the value of their deductions and credits. Is that a way to get at this that's more effective, more efficient than something like a minimum tax?
Well, if you were going to only allow, if you were going to write a tax rules that said you only got 80% of your credits, why don't you just give 80% of the credit? I mean, why don't you just make the credit 80% of what it was? It seems like, you know, at the heart of it, you really the policymakers ought to be looking at the incentives, and if they put those incentives in place because they believe in them, they should be available.
So you're of the school of either keep them or get rid of them. Yeah, okay. Let's talk about Pillar 1. It's gotten less attention, but it's also extremely controversial. And it rose from an effort by many countries to collect tax on big US tech companies. The OECD is trying to replace that cacophony of national taxes with a unified system. So for a long time, big tech companies used, I think it's fair to say, used inconsistencies among national tax laws to reduce the tax they owe on worldwide income. As more countries have moved to digital service taxes, those firms now face multiple taxation on the same income. So in that environment, do you think some multinationals would be more willing to support some sort of a unified system?
Well, I think I would describe Pillar 2 and the digital services taxes as being related to policymakers' concern about longstanding historic principles in international tax, the permanent establishment principle, where nexus and taxing authority in a country is based on physical presence, and that has been the law of the world and the law of treaties for many years. And as new technologies have allowed businesses to serve a market without physical presence, policymakers have begun to question those principles. And the idea of a digital services tax was developed originally in the European Union as a stopgap measure to tax sort of outside the income tax system while work was being done to update those or to change these long-standing standards, and change the way that taxing rights are allocated, with the idea that digital services taxes would then be eliminated, and that is what Pillar 1 is aiming to do. It is the case that Pillar 1 is not in any way limited to situations involving digital business models. In fact, it's the companies that are considered to be in scope of Pillar 1 that are subject to the Pillar 1 rules. It's based entirely on a revenue threshold and a profitability threshold. And so it's moved away from that original that original area of concern. But those businesses that are subject to digital services taxes would have the benefit of having those taxes eliminated if Pillar 1 was put in place. That said, Pillar 1 involves a degree of coordination among taxing authorities like we've never seen before. Not only do they need to agree on the same, because it involves a formulaic allocation of taxing rights. And so countries all have to agree on that same allocation to avoid there being any overlap. And not only do they need to agree sort of on the design of the rules at the policymaker level, but really we've got to think about the fact that they have to agree on the implementation and the application of those rules on a case-by-case basis, sort of day to day. And that is a level of coordination across multiple tax authorities that we've never seen before. And without that coordination, there would be overlapping Pillar 1 tax.
Right. So close the circle. Do you think it is, in this world, reasonable to expect we could get that level of cooperation?
Well, they certainly are working toward it. We've never seen a project like this current project in the OECD that involves not just the OECD and the G20, but 141 jurisdictions around the world. That makes it a truly global project, but also complicates it because all of those countries would need to reach those agreements. And I think it remains to be seen. They've recently put out documents proposing some tax certainty mechanisms, sort of dispute resolution or dispute prevention mechanisms with respect to Pillar 1. They were very complicated mechanisms. The documents reflected the commitment, the acknowledgement that getting certainty was absolutely essential. And I think that was that acknowledgement was very welcome. The processes will require a lot of commitment from the tax authorities, and actually a lot of involvement from the taxpayers as well. So again, it remains to be seen how it will work in practice. But there does seem to be a recognition of the fact that they have to have an effective mechanism for preventing disputes.
I guess one of the great challenges, of course, is that you could have one government that approves this now and in good faith goes forward, and then have an election in a couple of years and have another government in place in a country that's got a completely different perspective. And
that's true. And Pillar 1, because of the coordination required in Pillar 1, while it is up to each country to implement the rules, the agreement on Pillar 1 says that those rules will take effect when a critical mass of countries have the rules in place. And documents that just came out from the OECD indicate that critical mass will be defined, but it will necessarily include the countries that are the headquarters jurisdictions for a substantial majority of the companies that are in scope, because it's a relatively limited scope right now, given where the thresholds are set, as well as, importantly, key additional jurisdictions that under the Pillar 1 rules would be the countries that are being required to give up taxing rights because of those rights being allocated to other countries. And so I mean, they do recognize that they need to have agreement sort of the right countries. But they haven't, they don't have yet completely specific rules for defining who those countries are.
Well, Barbara, we are out of time. This has been a fascinating discussion, lots more to talk about. And of course, this is going to be an evolving subject. So we hope to have you back again at some time in the future and talk when we know more. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you.
And thank you to our audience as always.